sometimes it's not until we actually look at how well we work together that we realise actually that could be improved. And what I've experienced is sometimes people can hold quite fixed views of other agencies, and that can get in the way of multi-agency working. Has that been your experience?
Yeah, because I think, just taking back to what I said before, some of our basic values around compassion for each other and understanding where other people are coming from. I think that does get in the way of things. I think people's experience, their own personal and professional experience of a service may impact how they see that service. What I've seen in times of pressure, and this is internally as well as externally, and particularly pressure on resources, services are struggling, and because of that struggle, we perceive that they're not providing the service that we think they should be, and a lot of pressure is also placed on social care to provide, and that can create difficulties as well, because everyone's got an expectation of what the other person should be doing based on the pressures they're experiencing at that time. And if that's happened a number of times, if you're working with an agency and you've not had the best experience, or you've got families indicating they're not having the best experience, that can cloud your judgment when you go into a meeting. That can drive some of your behaviours and your thinking around that as well, rather than actually, let me just take a minute to understand what I'm expecting, what I need, and why the agency is not able to provide that. And also, I think sometimes having the confidence to say, I appreciate that, but it can't sit with us as social care because we've got a role. And I think that sometimes impacts as well, because it does feel like there's a big push on social care to, like you were saying before, find a placement or do something else. Those options that's not a fix to particularly what's going on outside, or because there's pressures on other agencies and stuff. That's not what's going to help the change or improve things for that child.
Yeah, there's something in what you're saying around how we bring networks together to maximise what they can do together. And also, I suppose my question as you were talking there was me thinking, what does social care or social work need other agencies to, or want other agencies to hear?
I think for me, I'd say this is me now speaking, but for me it is that it is a multi-agency response, and therefore when we come together, it's about what each individual agency can do within the remit of their service, so that we can create a plan to keep that child safe, meet their needs, and support that child and family and community to achieve those changes. And some of what's expected from social care is not a realistic option for that child at that time. I just go back to just think that actually to place a child somewhere else is actually, that's quite a big result, unless we have to do so for protection. And with this age group, that can look very different to how we try to protect them. So we're looking at that network. We're looking at that network to support us and help us in our planning and also our decision making, and to come around the table and an open forum of discussion, not I think social care should be doing this. What is it that you're able to offer? And also hear where we're coming from and where our restrictions are, or the difficulties that we're having in achieving some things.
So there's a starting point, isn't there, about people coming to the table with an openness to think through the presenting circumstance in advance of forming the view of what should happen.
Yeah.
What do you think other services need from social care?
No, that's a big question. I'd have to ask other services. What do other services need from social care? I think pretty much the same. Do you know that? I think probably sometimes they probably need a clear answer a bit more. Actually, let me just think. I had a meeting the other day, and it's a bit around, what it was around is around clear understanding and clarity of processes and procedures and what thresholds are and why things aren't happening. So I had a meeting, it was with police colleagues actually, but it was just to speak generally about our service and what we do. But the questions that were coming out of that, when I really thought about it, it was about actually what are thresholds, why might things not happen in this way, what do you do when you become concerned and we're not seeing any change, what processes are in place to kind of review that. So I think sometimes it's about a better understanding of what we're doing, because even when we're in the meetings, actually we're all working different departments. I only know you when you're sitting around the table discussing this young person and family. Do I always know about all the different processes and the levels you have to go through for decision making and stuff like that? So even just understanding how each other work, I think that's important. And I know where I work at the moment, they've done some like shadowing and stuff with other professionals so that they can get some insight into what it's like within children's services. And it's also offered that you can go out to other partners as well. I think really understanding, I think that's what services need sometimes. And they need just not clarity, but I think that open lines of communication is what comes out of every review that we have. It's just being open, having communication, keeping in contact with each other and speaking to each other on a really regular basis. That relationship, I think that's what they need. They need a relationship.
It's interesting because I was just thinking as you were talking, there's this sort of point around, have we sat down and worked out with each other what each of us can offer and at what point that's available or would be appropriate? And then have we agreed that if we think that there's disagreement, how we're going to resolve that before we focus on the actual disagreement? Do you see what I mean? There's something about how are we going to put in place something in networks that's going to help us focus on that. So that we don't, I mean, I have certainly in my practice, when I was certainly in my earlier practice, I've definitely gone into battle with other agencies, you know, for the reasons that I felt were right, but I don't think that was overall helpful for a multi-agency response. Like my reflection on that is, you know, you may win the argument, but what was the impact? If the impact wasn't that we achieved something better, then it's not helpful.
And that will be, and I'd mirror that. I think particularly in earlier parts of my career, and even sometimes I have to catch myself now, actually, and that's why I just go back to that child in the middle. What am I trying to achieve for that child and that family? And what is it? Even sometimes before a meeting, kind of taking a minute and saying, okay, I can feel that you're feeling quite rolled up at the moment. What's going on? And it's normally frustration and worry together. So actually just taking a minute to sit back and think what's going on here, because there's no point in calling people out in that way all the time. Sometimes it's about calling them in and sitting down and having a discussion, because you're not going to get anywhere. Just banging your head against a brick wall, basically, or against each other.
It's exactly that, isn't it? It's calling people in and having that conversation. I was talking the other day when we've got young people that in our assessment we think are suffering harm, and in our assessment we think they're a victim of exploitation, but they may have a really different view. They may believe that the person that we believe is exploiting them is actually someone who is really special and really positive, and that is a genuine feeling. That's a genuine need that's being met, that person's making them feel special. How do we work with that in practice?
We need to be really careful. I remember at one of your trainings you were actually saying this around where it may be the first time in a long time that someone's shown that child the level of attention or caring, how they see it. That's what they're seeing at the moment, or it's part of that process, isn't it? We call it grooming, we call it exploiting and stuff, but they've built a relationship with that individual that they thought was a relationship for a long period of time, and we've come along and said this is a harmful relationship for you. It's not a good relationship. That disclosure, what that child said, has such a massive impact around the whole family. What we've seen with individuals may end up going to court and stuff, and we've broken up that's really significant, because what else has that child got? And now you said, actually, this person's only showing me any form of attention or anything else because they wanted something out of me, in a history of people probably taking advantage of me as well. How do we deal with that? We need to understand where that child's coming from and look at it through the child's lens rather than our own lens. We see it as harmful and we need to protect, but we also need to understand what that child may be going through and the long-term impacts of that child and their relationships going forward as well. And sometimes I think we miss that because we do want to protect, and rightly so, we should be protecting, but we also need to think about, for that child, we've broken up what they've perceived to be a relationship. At that time, it's really hard to deal with because it can continue to impact. It's a loss, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the piece of the quote that you're talking about that I'd mentioned was it's from a piece of work called Keeping Safe by Cardiff University. Sophie Hallett was the researcher, and that's exactly what she was saying, and it made so much sense to me because what just saying is we're asking young people not only, you know, the risk or the possible outcome is that we may confirm to them their feelings of low self-esteem, lack of, you know, low self-worth, negative feelings about themselves if that person, we're saying actually they were using you. But we might also be asking them to confront some really harmful things in their relationships with others. And I don't think there's an easy answer to that, because what we wouldn't be saying is, well, you know, we won't take action to try and prevent someone exploiting or causing harm. But I suppose what you're describing is we need to factor that into the work that we're going to do, and how we're going to work with that young person, how we're going to understand what that relationship meant, and look for, you know, it may sound strange to some, but look for the positive motivators and look for what was positive about that relationship, even though in our assessment it was harmful.
Yeah, definitely, because if you're not understanding that part of it, you're missing a big thing, and that could be the drive to get back into a situation like that, or to gravitate back to those individuals, because we're not focusing on what that need was and what were they getting out of it, and actually is there anything we can do around that, and allowing that space and that openness with someone that you're working with to speak about that, and being able to, you know, just allow them to talk, not sitting down and judging them for what's going on, what happened within that relationship and what they got out of it. That's actually was a norm for them. It's not based on what our own feelings are around that. I remember another young person saying sometimes they speak and it's a shock that we show sometimes around what's being said, and actually that makes them withdraw even more. So I think it's really important that we recognise that, even if it's uncomfortable with us, and use those spaces to speak about how it causes us uncomfort as well, to kind of think about it in that way. Because yes, we need to protect, definitely. We're going to take action, like you said, but we need to see it through that child's lens and what it's meant for them.
We talked earlier about certain things, certain forms of harm that may have existed before, that weren't recognised. I'm also conscious around the development of how society's changed in the last 20 years, the internet, social media, everything else that's going on. And someone else had mentioned that when I or others may have been growing up, we may have had like 30 or 60 people that we sort of knew. And now online people have got hundreds, if you know, not thousands of people that they're judging themselves against. And thinking about the impact that has. And one of the things that I was thinking about is, are we seeing different forms of harm in adolescent services, and who are the children that are impacted?
We're seeing the harm that we online, and the online world and how that instigates a lot is massive now. Really need to understand that, what that means, and the relationship that older children have with the online world. Even in our assessments, we didn't used to look at that. It used to be like a small part, but actually we need to be assessing that and what that network looks like and what's that community for that child. Because at least if you break down that community for that child or remove them from it, you isolate them even further. That's their world. The children that we're seeing because of the internet, I'm going to say this can hit anyone. Trouble can knock on anyone's door. We have our young people that we know are more vulnerable because of their experiences and what's happened to them. But and research says they're more likely to be vulnerable to exploitation or harm outside the home or serious youth violence. But I see that it knocks on anyone's door, basically. But that's because the worlds that they're in are completely different. So when I was growing up, now I feel really old. Completely different in terms to what they're exposed to, what they see, what, like you said, what they're judging their own personality and how they should be it's just there, it's instant, isn't it? It's in their face. So it's a complete different world. And I think we need to understand children's worlds and what they're living in at the moment, definitely. But I think it's a lot for us to navigate as well as professionals, because when you say holistic assessment, and you spoke about youth justice, that was community, family relationships, education and stuff. We're looking massively at what community and context looks like, completely different to what we did before.
Do you know, it's interesting, I sometimes think about youth justice, and I know that children were going through the criminal justice system, and ideologically my view was, well, why have children being criminalised if they're vulnerable, they're being exploited and they're in need of services? And over time what we've seen is a reduction in children coming through the criminal justice system, but they're getting not as good a response. And the reason I wonder if they aren't getting such a good response is because we haven't built those multi-agency teams in the same way across the country in the way that youth offending teams came about. So you could have a child that would come in through the youth justice system and they had immediate access in the main to substance services, to child and adolescent mental health, to transition really to adult services through probation and through those networks. We were looking more at employability through the lens of diversion reactivity, but we had systems that were in place that did bring together partners. And I wonder if where we need to move to is to create similar approaches, albeit within social care settings.
Yeah, definitely. Coming from a youth justice background, I've always said that that's what we need, because we know the needs are slightly different, but we know the factors that will impact on that cohort of young people. And within, like you've just said, having that immediate access to services that child needed at that point made such a difference. The services that the service I currently work in, although they might, so because it's integrated with youth justice as well, we have access to that consultation and stuff, and it's so helpful. We have access to a drug worker we can speak to, even if they're not on a youth justice order and they're not working directly with them. So we have that access. I think it makes it more difficult when you're accessing from outside. So you've got to go to partners sometimes because of their own resources. So you're waiting on waiting lists and that child needs a response right now. So I totally agree. I know they're looking at potential youth hubs and stuff and what that looks like, or young people's hubs. But I think that would be a really good step in that direction, because that's the multi-agency hub or the multi-agency team that you need in this work to be the same way you do with adults. So that model where you've got a drugs worker and you've got a psychologist, it should be right across, not just because you're accessing one service, be it youth justice.
And in the community.
Definitely.
And thinking back to, do you remember when they had a big double-decker bus that used to travel around the county?
Yeah.
And you could go on the bus and you could get access to services, and we had youth workers there. And, you know, there's something about being available at the time and in the place that people need us. Yeah.
And that consistency, because, again, like I said at the beginning, there's some really good areas of practice across UK, but that consistency right across around actually where there are youth workers, we've got youth workers, we've got like that hub, we've got everything that we need for that young person at that time that they can access. They've just got to come to us. They can walk into a building and access it when they need it. We talk about those windows of opportunities, and that's what we need to create, that windows of opportunity in the community and where they are.
Do you know, it's interesting because I know that our paths have crossed in different roles that I've held, and certainly in my role in British Transport Police, the national, you know, the children we're talking about travel all over the all over the counties, up and down the country, and there is no national approach to people that are being trafficked and people that are being exploited from one place to another. So I think what you're highlighting is something that I think our sector needs to push towards, actually thinking maybe we need to think more outside of our geographical boundaries about how we work differently.
Yeah, definitely.
I don't know what that looks like at this point in time, but I feel like there's something because you can have different children from different places open to different local authorities, open to different police forces, and there is no universal way, it would appear in my experience, to bring that together or to have oversight of what that looks like.
And pulling people together that are kind of doing the similar work together to think about what that model looks like, and to actually have a consistent model that people are working with, built on the best practice across. I think that's definitely what we've needed. I sat with people that are working in adolescent services, and they've said the same thing. It's kind of a more national approach or national strategy around how we deal with this that can be kind of rolled out, which is an approach that everyone's kind of using. Obviously, it's going to be different in different areas because of what the need is, but at least it's something to work with.
And in terms of that need, what are young people, what are families saying to your services? What are they saying is happening and what they need? I know it's going to be different for different people in different places, different communities. What are some of the things that come up for them in your work?
Access to services, lack of resource and lack of money is a big thing at the moment. Being able to education and access to health services, getting a response when they need it. One of our biggest challenges sometimes is that, particularly working with older children, is that when we do start to work with them, they've experienced a number of different referral routes in, or a number of different professionals, and by the time they get to us, those families are tired. They're worn out. Parents often sometimes feel like they're blamed, so they want people to work with them rather than kind of doing to them. And they often say that, actually, I've been asking for help for ages, and at that point you've got a family that's, the relationships are broken down completely, and a child that's at edge of care because those parents are tired or the family network's tired. So I think prevention, early support early when it's identified, and that takes me back to people being able to identify those factors that may contribute later to people coming even more entrenched, and then the work becomes harder because that child is traumatised, the family's traumatised, and we're trying to work and unpick what's happened for them. Yeah,
and so by the time they come to you, that's happened. So the earlier you can get in.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, then it needs just vary so much. There's so much going on, and I think we saw, as you know, through services, I think after lockdown, the increase of families and their need for additional support is ever so more evident, and I think the complexities have increased, definitely. So there's multiple needs for families, and I think that's being able to access things when they need it. So to go back to the hubs that you were speaking about before, actually, for a family to be on a waiting list, and not only have we got the concerns around exploitation, but we might be waiting for a diagnosis for a child, or we might be waiting for a service for a child via health, or just something that a child needs, and they're on a waiting list. That's what families are struggling with, because they're like, okay, you've done this piece of work, but we're still waiting for the additional resource that we need, which means that family can escalate back at any point.
I was thinking as well around, there's so much in what you just said, because I want to ask you about when you're saying that parents often come to you or families are coming to you and they feel blamed, either the child's being blamed or the parents are being blamed. And then if you're going into child protection or you're going into Section 47, whatever that might be, how do you approach that in a way that isn't punitive towards children and families?
I think the way that it is now, a lot of the framework is around actually working with the parent, but identifying actually we're at a point now where we do have to go down that route. We do have to go to child protection. We manage most of particularly harm outside the home via the child in need process, and the strats focus on, although they look at everything and all the family factors, clearly what's happening for that child outside the home. So I think it's what I'm going back to. Families need to know what we're doing and why we're doing it. We need to be open and honest if we've got concerns around parental factors and the changes that we need to see. And I think that navigation is really important. So if it is a concern outside the home and we're doing work around that, what do we need from that parent? What additional do we need for that parent to engage with or be able to protect that child? And when we're not seeing that, what's the consequence of that as well? And a lot of the time that I have to deal with complaints. But a lot of the time it is about that lack of understanding or just being open and honest, actually. This may happen if we don't see this change because we're so worried about your child and the risks that may come to them.
I think what you describe as well is much more around how do we work in a way that's alliance-based, and actually that child, the parent perhaps doesn't hold the ability to prevent that child being harmed because they're being groomed and controlled by someone else. I don't know if we always explain that effectively to families because they might hear child protection, but actually for me it's about planning. For me it's about how we do that work. There's something else I wanted to ask you earlier, which I know we're running along, so maybe this will feature in a bit earlier. But I wanted to ask, because in adolescent services we have such a multitude of different forms of harm, but we also have a multitude of different individual needs that our young people have. So I was going to say how do we, but I kind of feel that I'm making an assumption that it needs to improve. And so what I wanted to ask was, what do you think needs to improve for us to better respond to children and other characteristics like sexuality, like neurodiversity, like race, like disability? How do we make sure that we are conscious and aware of how those factors impact individual children so that we make sure that we are able to respond in a way that is as effective as possible or understands where they might be coming from, what they've experienced?
Different areas will do that slightly differently, and the training behind that is really important. So people, again, looking through the eyes of where that individual's coming from and exploring all of those things and being confident to explore all of those things. So the biggest one when I've spoken, some people are really good at looking race, sexuality and how that impacts on the individual, where they live, their background, their history, what's going on for the family. Some people really struggle sometimes with that. And despite if you've rolled out training around graces and everything else, unless you're regularly bringing that into supervision spaces, and unless you're regularly challenging that as a service as a whole, but within those spaces, within supervision, with practitioners and speaking about it, I'm not sure it's as consistent as we'd like it to be. And some people struggle. The biggest thing they struggle to speak about sometimes is sexuality and race, and really struggle to have those conversations because they're worried about getting it wrong.
Yeah,
they're worried about offending, and actually then what you do is you just ignore. And that leaves people feeling even more isolated and like you don't care.
yeah.
So I think there's a big space for that to keep those discussions happening, and not just we're rolling it out this week and actually we'll leave it for another couple of months and then we'll do some more on it. Actually, it needs to be that consistent thread that runs through the work that we do.
Some of those social graces, there's power in all of them. Some of them can intersect to increase safety and some can intersect to compound vulnerability. So they're not static factors, if you know what I mean. They're factors that, and I suppose what we're often, I think in social care, what we're asking people to do is to recognise their own social graces. So if my social grace is, if sexuality isn't that important to me and it's maybe a 0 or a 1 on the sort of scale, then if my view is, well, sexuality, you can be who you want, it's not important, but actually I'm working with someone and sexuality is so important and it's impacted their life, it's impacted who they are. There's a difference. And there's something about how we recognise through what we're seeing through our lens and how that relates to the work that we're trying to do.
And how it impacts on the work that we're doing as well. Because like you just said, actually, if it's not important to me, or I can function in a way of just ignoring it and not speaking about it, and then I'm not challenged about that and how it impacts on me and how that might impact on the families when I go out to them. If I'm not talking about it or I don't see it as that important, you've then lost that conversation. You're then not able to assess when you go out, so you're missing a whole need for that child and what that might mean for that child. I just remember once just speaking about a child that travelled here, and what that looks like for her in terms of being a female within her family and how females were viewed. And then when she came here as well and how she was treated, so significant. And then to have that discussion around being a female for the practitioner as well and what that meant as well, and really unpicking that is quite important, because actually that is going to motivate people to behave in the way they are, or like you said, leave them feeling completely isolated. Because if you're going into a space where people aren't speaking about your race or not speaking about your sexuality, and you're in a home that's doing the same thing, or you're in a school environment, I've now just come in as a professional and just shut you down completely, and I'm not talking about it. So you're just adding to that, and actually you're meant to be the person that's kind of assessing to understand what my needs and what's driving some of the behaviours that I might be presenting with.
The reason that I thought about is when you were talking about people that may come to other agencies, and that might be through their professional experience, through history, or through their own personal experience, and we often come at things as social work or as statutory institutions and say, we're here to safeguard. But for some people, that might not be their experience of those services.
From a multi-agency perspective as well, and we've identified needs and we've seen there's other needs there, and we need to kind of understand what the drivers are behind that, and we need to be sensitive to factors that are impacting that family due to their history, their culture, their background, their beliefs, their attitudes and stuff. That, for me, I'm just thinking about one family in particular. If your experience through children's services may have been that I don't feel like and I say children's services, it might be health, it might be with the police, I don't think like you've been helpful at this point, or I don't feel like you've understood where I'm coming from and why my survival mode, or why I might respond to this situation in this way. You've missed my need and what it is that I might need to engage with to be able to change, because you're not identifying, you're not speaking about that. You're not speaking about that I may parent in a different way because that's how I understand to parent. You're not speaking about actually it's a norm with where I live for this to be happening. So I wouldn't know any different, and I've just grown into that. But actually you're now telling me that I need to respond in a different way, or I've got the opportunity to do things in a different way, but you're not even thinking about that because you're only looking at me through your lens and what you expect life to be, or what your life's been. And that's, and that's why it's important.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that says it all, doesn't it? One of the things that I was always taught, and I noticed what's changed over 20 years. I'll tell you one thing. When I went into social care, there were people that had been in practice for between 5 and 25 years, 24 years actually. Yeah. And they were still in direct practice. They were still senior practitioners in the team, and I learnt my work from them. Yeah. And they taught me about chronologies, and I didn't just tell me I had to do one. They taught me why it was important and how that information informed my understanding of family history and functioning and the prediction of future risk and all of these things. But what it really did is it really honed my focus on the so what question. So we've done the assessment, we've gathered the information, so what? Yeah. What are we going to do about it? Yeah. And so I wanted to ask you about, how do we ensure that we've got plans that are effective or impactful?
So what we should do, if I said should, is once we're completing that assessment as well, I think from the assessment stage, it's really important that I'm not teaching anyone to suck eggs, but I know that we don't always get this bit right. That sharing with the family, sitting down, it's the child's assessment. I love the areas that are now writing it in to the child as a letter, because we really think about the language and what's going into there. That should be pulling out all your analysis, what we identified as the needs, and going into that plan. And the plan's really important. It's a plan that you sit down with the family and complete. It's not what I think you should be doing. What are they able to engage with and what are they able to do? And that plan, be it the intervention plan, child in need plan, child protection plan, safety plan, it is so important from the start that you've got that family alongside you. Because if I sit down and I just write out a whole plan for you that's meaningless and not important to you, it doesn't make sense. So for example, I remember when we used to write out, we'll address your substance misuse and stop using cannabis. Who is going to do, like, literally at that point, can we be realistic in, is the child in a place to be able to do that? What's going on around that child now for them to be able to do that? That's what we would like them to achieve. But it's actually their plan and you've put it right at the top. So that's your worry, actually not theirs. Because in the network they are in at the moment and they've been using for so long, they're not stopping right now. What else can we do? Do they want to get back into education right now? What is it going on for that mum that's so important right at this point before we look at everything else? And I think that's really important. Sitting down and actually having a realistic plan. Stop doing plans stop writing your own plans and giving them to families. Because I know if you walked in and gave me a plan, and I haven't been part of it, I'm not going to engage with it.
I wouldn't do that.
I wouldn't engage with it at all. And there's the thing though, to be honest, James, there's the thing, isn't it? We have expectations on families, right? And we have to sometimes sit back and say, okay, if I was a social worker and I knocked on my door, what would be the response in the way that I'm actually responding to the family right now? And if I think that I'm going to tell you to do one off the doorstep, I need to reflect on myself and change that.
What's interesting is I remember when I wrote my first plan, I was training and I'd looked at all these other plans and I'd kind of like written, oh, right, that's happened. So that's what that should look like. And I was kind of like, and I thought I'd done all right. And then I basically went to talk it through and they're like, this is just a generic plan. This isn't specific to the child. And I was thinking, actually, I suppose we have extensive experience now. And I suppose that's the thing around actually what we have to be thinking about is what's realistic for that young person, but also what is realistic for the network, because we often chuck the network into this and we say, well, the child has to go back to school or the police need to do this or CAMS and health need to do this, and we haven't spoke to them. And so that goes back to your point around sort of bringing people around the table and thinking, actually, all of us together, thinking about the positions that we're each coming from, thinking about the things that we've got in our arsenal. What is it that we can actually do that's going to work? And it might not be that we get to the end result. It might be the starting point is our key focus is building a relationship. And if we do it, and not just a relationship to do X or to do Y, you will have had referrals. Can you build a relationship? Great. To do what? So you have all of that. There's okay, I know. Were you going to say something else?
I was just going to say, and being comfortable that your plan may just say, right now we're working on building a relationship. And that's the part I love. When I worked in youth justice, we managed risk, but actually it was about building a relationship with that child, because particularly when I started to work with the higher risk young people, forget just being able to roll out the knife crime stuff or the stuff around their offending behaviour. They were so at a point in their life where they needed to build a relationship and trust. And those were the bits that I really enjoyed, kind of, even if it was sitting in a room with a child that didn't speak to me, going back and just seeing them start to get used to you. Actually, you are going to be here and you are going to listen to me. And just spending some time to hear about them to build that relationship. That
relationship as well is not just where you come in and they're just being pumped for information. It's something where they're actually having an impact on you. Like the young people that I've worked with, or older children that I've worked with, like there's something that I've been moved by their experiences, their talents, build like a genuine relationship where there's something that is not just that I'm coming because I want to get information from you. Do you know what I mean? There's something around, and there's limitations to what that relationship might look like versus a personal relationship they've got in their own life. And also being clear about that.
Yeah, definitely.
The last thing on that would be, for me, is that we talk a lot about building relationships and suddenly they end. And in my experience, the ending of relationships are much harder than the start of them. And I think we need to keep focus on that around, at some point this relationship is likely to end or will end. How are we planning for that?
And just bring up a good point. You're building a relationship, use that network, because sometimes we can get into, I've built a relationship with this child, and we then take everything on ourselves and we're not thinking about the end and the impact that ending's going to have on that child. As they're making the changes, starting to bring someone that's able to work with and be with that child long term, whether it be a family member, like you said, a youth worker. There are services that can work for a longer period of time. It may be a mentor, it may be someone in school that's going to carry them through, but that's the importance of making sure you've got those other professionals and those
Yeah.
key people as part of the plan.
So it's that relationship as
Yeah.
the vehicle to build the longer term structure, relationships.
Behind that child, yeah, definitely.
Last question. What keeps you going?
Do you know what? I was thinking about this. I'm just passionate about this work. I spoke to someone the other day. I've been in assessment. I've done other pieces of work, and I always wanted to work with older children. That was it. I still think there's a lot, as we've spoken about today, in terms of development that we need. And one of the things that really struck to my core is that I always felt that they got a raw deal when it came to safeguarding, because the challenges that some people experience and don't want to work with this age group, rightly so. You know, actually, and when I say rightly so, not wanting to work, but understanding that it's a challenge for them. It's one of the age group that no matter what happens, there's always something that's going to happen and they're going to get penalised for, or legislation's going to change constantly when we're meant to be giving them structure. So that is my passion. I'm just, when it comes to working with older children, making sure that they're safeguarded, because I've worked long enough to see that it's been a journey to get to this point, to identify that it's not just about the behaviour that you're seeing, there's needs behind there and they're being harmed. And we need to do something about that.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming.
Thank you.